Hi, everyone. This is Brian Rowe with National Catholic Reporter and EarthBeat. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Robert Bullard, who's a professor of urban planning and environmental policy at Texas Southern University. He's also the author of 18 books, and he's widely known as the father of environmental justice. Dr. Bullard, it's good to have you with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So I thought a good place for us to start would just kind of the concept of environmental justice itself. How would you define that?
Well, environmental justice embraces the principle that all communities are entitled to equal protection of environmental, housing, transportation, energy, food security, and that no community should be somehow discriminated against or left out because of their race or income or their location.
And from what I understand, you became involved with environmental justice before that term really had even caught on through a lawsuit that your wife was working on. Is that right?
That's correct. As a matter of fact, it was 1978, and my wife accepted, Linda McKeever Bullard accepted a case involving the location of a municipal landfill here in Houston, and she took the case, and she needed someone to collect data for her lawsuit to try to have something to go into court that was that could be empirically sound and showing where all the landfills and incinerators and the garbage dumps are located in Houston from the 30s up until 1978. And so I got drafted into doing this, and the case was filed in 1979, more than 40 years ago. And it was the first lawsuit challenging environmental racism used in civil rights law. It was Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management Corporation. And it basically said that the location of landfills in Houston was a form of discrimination because they were being targeted for Black communities. And so I had 10 students in my research methods class at Texas Southern, where I am now. And we were able to document that from the 30s up until 1978, 100% of all the city-owned landfills, 5 out of 5 were located in Black neighborhoods in Houston. 6 out of the city-owned incinerators were in Black neighborhoods, and 3 out of 4 of the privately owned landfills are in Black neighborhoods, which translated into 82% of all the garbage dumped in Houston from the 30s up to 1978 was dumped in Black neighborhoods, even though Blacks made up only 25% of the population. So that was the basis for that discrimination lawsuit and the study that I did in '79.
Mm-hmm. And you've been working on this issue ever since then.
Yeah, working on it in different iterations and different ways. It's changed over the many years. And again, 1979, there was no environmental justice. And the concept of environmental justice was not something that was just thrown around with people understanding exactly what it. But the idea that everybody produces garbage, everybody produces waste, but everybody doesn't have to live next to where the waste is disposed or treated, et cetera. And the same holds true in terms of the location of refineries, chemical plants, highways, and planners call that those types of facilities locally unwanted land uses, or LULUs. And so the LULUs are not randomly distributed. All communities are not created equal. There are some that are more equal than others. And if a community happens to be poor, working class, or a community of color, it generally receives more than its fair share of things that other people don't want. That's the injustice involved. And it's more than just environmental. It also involves health and wealth. When these many facilities are placed near homeowners, they lower the property value, which means lowering wealth. They also create pollution, which is also impacting health. So it's a double whammy that we're fighting when we're fighting any of these environmental challenges.
Mm-hmm. With the protests that are happening now in response to the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others, as the nation's kind of at a new moment of reckoning with racism, what does Black Lives Matter mean in the context of environmental justice?
It's really centered. And if you look at the birth of the environmental justice movement in the early '80s in Warren County, it was about fighting environmental racism. It was about fighting the location of targeting a Black community for toxic waste dumping, and the idea of the decision that went into making the choice for where to go. It was totally based on race. And over the years, the fact that many polluting facilities that pump out deadly poison that really choke communities, that people who wake up, 2 o'clock in the morning because of some explosion has occurred across the fence from a factory that's sending a deadly plume of gas or some other kind of chemical throughout the neighborhood, and people are told to shelter in place, which means that close your doors and shut the windows and pray. And you don't know if you're going to live or die, if that chlorine gas is going to come through and kill you. And so people have been choking and saying they haven't breathed. They can't breathe for decades. And so the convergence of this whole issue of environmental racism and racism in policing and the deadly killings and choking of Black people and seeing these televised lynching, it's come full circle. And so it's one movement, and that movement is for justice, and it's a movement to dismantle systemic racism that's causing communities not to be able to breathe because they're encircled with polluting chemical plants and refineries and other kinds of emissions, as well as the deadly choking of the breaths of unarmed individuals and taking those lives, and while people call for, I can't breathe. That is the drama and the extent to which these things connect. It's really incredible, and to see over these many years that the dots are now being connected, and the underlying condition is racism. The underlying condition is systemic, institutionalized racism. And then you add on top of that the pollution that's killing people, and then the deadly policing that's killing people, and then you add coronavirus. Also, because of the underlying conditions that many of our people live, and particularly poor people and African Americans, other people of color, COVID-19 is hitting our communities especially hard. And because of pollution, because of asthma and respiratory illnesses, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, we're seeing that kind of deadly attack also occurring. And so we're fighting on a number of fronts. And I think this is the time when you see those young people out there. You see many generations out there from many racial and ethnic groups, socioeconomic groups out there, and they're there because of these underlying conditions that's driving these disparities. And so we all are saying now it's time to dismantle racism and own up to this the fact that America's DNA is stamped with racism, and we need to unpack, and we need to dismantle that evil, violent system.
You mentioned there the idea of kind of connecting the dots of these different challenges, struggles, whether it's racism, the pandemic, pollution, all of these things. It reminded me of kind of what Pope Francis has talked about in his encyclical Laudato Si', where he says that everything is connected, and he talks about hearing the cry of the earth at the same time as the cry of the poor. What power kind of does that message from a prominent religious leader kind of add to the environmental justice movement, and kind of what role can faith communities play in environmental justice?
Well, the environmental justice movement is an extension of the civil rights movement and the struggle for human rights. And some of the first major movement building strategies came out of the church, came out of the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, a Black civil rights organization based in a white denomination. And so we've had collaborations with the various denominations in terms of, United Church of Christ, United Methodists, Catholics, Lutherans. And so that civil rights history and how we cherish that history, and that history filters into our environmental justice movement. Dr. King was a Baptist minister, and the idea of religion playing a major part in the modern civil rights movement. It's playing a major part in our environmental justice movement in terms of the constituencies that are oftentimes that can, they use their church as their meeting place for fighting for justice, and many of our priests and ministers and imams have really worked very hard to challenge the institutional framework that will keep pollution somehow concentrated in one area. But we know that ultimately it will affect us all, and because there's one earth, and when we don't protect the most vulnerable, we place everybody at risk. And so we were talking about justice for all. We're talking about making sure that no community is left behind, whether it's during a disaster, natural or man-made, or whether it's doing a pandemic like right now, or whether it's talking about addressing issues of affordable housing, healthcare, or policing. And I think the religious leaders have a major role, and have always played a major role when it comes to justice issues. And I think that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Within the Catholic Church in the U.S., there are over 500 parishes that have formed creation care teams. Some of them have been long established, some of them are new. In addition to that, there's plenty of women religious congregations and other religious congregations and colleges that are trying to address issues related to the environment. What advice would you give to them in terms of how to make sure that environmental justice is central to that work that they're doing? What are steps that you'd recommend that they might take?
Well, I think it's very important that those initiatives are undertaken, and I think that leadership is definitely needed to bring about the awareness, but also developing community-university relationships, partnerships, and basically having kinds of initiatives and programs that are not just on the campus, but are actually in the communities, and to really take advantage of students, not take advantage in a negative way, but to use the students to have the communities to be their classrooms, and to build those partnerships and those relationships and those coalitions that can work on these issues. And I think we will build those intergenerational alliances, and our universities, college and university will be much stronger, and definitely our community-based organization will be much stronger, and our churches will be much stronger. I think it's when we talk about environmental justice is also racial justice, and I think it's also about healing, about acknowledging the pain that's in many of our communities, and this pain has been there for decades, in some cases centuries. And so we need to have moments of clarity and moments of trying to understand and empathize and move forward and together. And I think that's a good thing. And this time that we're in now, I think there's so many opportunities to do that.
Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of talk lately about the need for uncomfortable conversations to be had, especially among white people around race and privilege. What are some of those conversations that white people should be having around race and the environment?
Well, I think it's important that that conversation around races is uh, it occurs among white people, and I think in some cases it needs to occur when people of color are not in the room, so you can really get honest, really brutal about what is going on in this country. And I think when I talk with many of my white brothers and sisters, we get really real. And in some cases, if it's happening for the first time, a lot of whites will get on put on the defense. And my thing is, no. I'm not saying you own slaves. Like, well, I didn't own any slaves. So what? To unpack white privilege and to unpack the fact that there are certain advantages built into our economic system, our political system, social systems, and systems of advancing in our society, that whiteness comes with certain types of privileges. And if you're not white, there are taxes or there are certain types of penalties that are artificially applied, whether it's in housing, whether it's in education, employment, advancing across the board, whether it's what kinds of communities people are allowed to live in. Even when they have money, there are certain barriers that occur in our society, and we have to not let race somehow divide us, because there's only one race. That's the human race. Race is a social construct. I'm a sociologist, and there's a whole field of sociology that deals with race and race relations. So that's we have to own those conversations. And the good thing about it is that the millennial generation outnumbered the baby boomers, my generation, and the fact that as you move beyond the baby boom the millennial generation, those numbers are really very high. And so the majority of the people in this country are not millennials, who have baggage that when we talk about race as a wedge issue, we talk about, in some cases, religion as a baggage, as a wedge, a baggage issue. We talk about other kinds of issues that have been used to keep us apart. And so we need to have those honest conversations. And once we have them, to own own the conversations that we've had, and talk about how we're going to change them, and come up with a plan, a strategy, and commit. And this is not a sprint. This is a marathon kind of a race, because we're talking 401 years that African Americans and Africans were brought to these shores. And again, 1619 is a long time ago. And none of us were around in 1619, but the vestiges of institutionalized of racism and the vestiges of slavery, what came after, still with us today. And we need to unpeel the onion and take those layers off and say how we're gonna fix this. And I think it will require some hard work. This is not going to be easy. If it was easy, we would have done it years ago.
Mm-hmm. In terms of solutions, there's a lot of ideas being thrown out there right now. What is, in terms of environmental justice, what do those solutions look like in addressing racism?
I think what we have to do when we talk about environmental racism and environmental justice, we have to talk about what really essentials are. That means that all communities should have a right to a clean and healthy, livable environment. That no community should somehow be targeted for things that other people don't want. We want a healthy, livable environment. We're talking about changing our whole paradigm in terms of what kind of economy we should have. And if we are moving to a clean energy, renewable energy, green economy, then that economy should not leave people behind just because they're poor, just because they're people of color. We're talking about a just transition that will be inclusive. We talk about environmental justice is also talking about health equity, making sure that people have access to health care, access to a safe workplace. And we're talking about employment with opportunities where people have a livable, not a minimum wage, a livable wage, and that people can have employment and opportunity that they can take care of their families and live out the American dream, buy homes, and being able to buy homes and live in housing that's not in floodplains and next to the refinery, the landfill. We talk about, education and making sure that educational opportunity is open to all. Everybody's not going to be able to go to college, university, but some making sure that junior college and community colleges are available to young people, and making sure that their skills and training that people can get jobs so that they can have good careers and that kind of thing. Environmental justice involves all of that. We're not just fighting pollution, we're fighting for a good economy that can provide a good, healthy, and sustainable lifestyles for everybody. Parks and green space, good farmers markets, and good access to supermarkets and other kinds of grocery stores that can make people have access to alternatives to just going to the fast food and eating all the junk and all of that. We're talking about food security and the kinds of built environment amenities that we know, and the science will show and the data will show that's what make communities healthy and sustainable and livable. That's what environmental justice is all about, and that's what we will be pushing for as we look at these candidates for the presidential races, for the governorships, and for the legislature, for the city council, and county commissioners, school boards. And so that's what we're talking about, all and up and down the electoral process. And we know environmental justice is also about political justice, fighting against this voter suppression. America is a democracy, and a cornerstone in this democratic process is voting. And so we're saying that voting should be universal, and that people should not somehow have to overcome these artificial barriers to vote. And we know it's real. Voter suppression is real, and I live in the South. But it's not just in the South. We have to make sure that we fight for free elections and fair elections across the board.
One of the last things I have for you, a lot of environmental groups have come out and issued statements, some of them acknowledging the wider environmental movement's lack of diversity or struggles itself with racism or inequalities within that movement of what it's been focused on, and kind of addressing kind of these issues of environmental justice. What would it look like for the wider environmental or climate movement to put environmental justice at the center of their work?
Yeah, what we have been saying for many years is that the green groups or the mainstream environmental groups, which are pretty much still white, have to take into account that this country is changing demographically, and their organizations need to change with it. And as we move to 2045, when the majority of the people in this country will be people of color, and I'm saying the organizations that are out there working on environment and conservation, climate, need to take into account these changing demographics and to start to acknowledge the fact that many of the agendas that they have may not necessarily reflect the priorities of that emerging majority. And I think to understand that diversity also means diversity on their boards and staffs and their agendas, but diversity also means making sure that we diversify the green dollars that's going to environmental work. So the green dollars can also go to people of color organizations that work on environment, work on justice, that work on climate. And that climate change has to be more than parts per million in greenhouse gases, that it also has to be about impacting those vulnerable communities and those frontline communities, and the policies that get put in place to show that that when we address climate mitigation and adaptation, that equity, fairness, and justice run throughout those the planning. And so that's where that would be my advice, making those statements. And almost all the groups that I can think of have made statements about embracing racial justice. And again, racial justice starts at home, and we extend it out, and that we are much stronger when we work together on these issues. And this is the right time. Dr. King said, the time is right, is always right to do the right thing. And that applies to this era in which we find ourselves locked down in many cases, and staying home at many cases, and doing Zoom calls in many cases, keeping our communication networks going, and working, and still organizing, mobilizing, educating. We have to do that even during this time. And when we do open back up, we can still do the face-to-face and working together and moving this agenda for justice across the board, not just environmental justice, climate justice, but for economic justice, racial justice, and justice in our criminal justice system.
Are you optimistic that this can be that moment where that brings about justice across the board in all those areas?
I am optimistic, and I am hopeful, and this time seems different. I've been on, in different movements for decades, and I've seen change. And every, being a student of history and a student of sociology, I know that every social movement that has been successful in this country has had a strong youth, student, and young people's driving movements. And when we have this intergenerational movement, as I see today, and as you can see in living color across the television set and across the globe, you can see the enthusiasm. And I think the important thing that you see is the urgency that unlike many, fits and starts outrage, this one seems, as I said, different. An understatement, maybe, but that differentness, I think, holds hope for us getting it right, and that you see these, you see people who are coming together, who probably this may be their first march or their first major demonstration, and it's occurring at a time that we are experiencing a pandemic, and that the fact that there are dangers out there, and there are dangers when you go back home. But again, we have to talk about this is a crisis. And the latest poll shows that 80% of Americans feel that this country is out of control. We need to get back control of our country and what we stand for. America is a great country, and we have to make sure that we live up to that creed, that North Star, that we want to be the best America that we can. And I think that is what we should be shooting for as we mobilize and organize, and as we educate to transform this country to become the best that it can be.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bullard, for taking the time to speak with me today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. And be safe.